Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Boris Johnson has insisted that Britain will not enforce checks on goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland under his Brexit deal. He has been under pressure to clarify his stance after he gave a briefing in Northern Ireland last night in which he appeared to contradict previous government statements. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Page is in Belfast for us now. And what have businesses in Northern Ireland made of it all?
Well, the big Brexit conundrum has been this. How do you avoid checks on the land border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic while also avoiding checks on goods moving between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK? Well, last night Boris Johnson gave an off-the-cuff briefing to local Tory party members in County Armagh, and he said that businesses who were sending products from Northern Ireland to Great Britain wouldn't have to fill in any paperwork, though in the past the Brexit Secretary Stephen Barclay and the Home Office have both indicated there would need to be some kind of administrative process. There have been more questions, though, over the issue of goods moving in the other direction, goods making the journey from Great Britain into Northern Ireland that are destined to stay here and not cross the border into the Irish Republic. Mr Johnson said there wouldn't need to be any checks at all on those goods, but trade experts here and business groups have said they believe there will need to be checks because under the Brexit deal, well, Northern Ireland will have to follow some of the rules of the EU single market, for example, on food produce. That's led Labour to accuse Mr Johnson of not understanding the deal that he himself has negotiated. This afternoon, when questioned about this, Mr Johnson was emphasising that he thought this was a great deal for Northern Ireland. All these issues may be very tactical, Sophie, but they're also highly political, and not just here in this part of the UK where they're going to practically matter the most.
Chris Page, thank you.
Now, the Scottish National Party launched their election campaign today, but Boris Johnson managed to steal their headlines, possibly by accident. Speaking to party members in Northern Ireland, he said that under his Brexit deal, there would be no forms, checks or barriers of any kind for goods moving between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, a comment at odds with what his own ministers have said. So does the Prime Minister need to make more stringent checks on his own deal? Our political correspondent Liz Bates reports.
Yeah, a piece of cake, this. What could possibly go wrong?
Boris Johnson was once again out on the election campaign trail this morning, visiting a school in Nottingham.
What could go wrong? What could go wrong? It's all going horrible. Hang on.
The answer came just hours later when this video emerged of him insisting that his Brexit deal would mean free movement of goods between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Asked if any paperwork at all will be needed, he says,
"You're not going. There will be no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind. You will have unfettered access."
But that wasn't what was agreed with EU leaders last month, as the minister overseeing Brexit preparations confirmed just this morning.
It will be the case that there will be some administrative processes, but in no way are they checks as commonly understood.
Well, we've got the Prime Minister being casual about what he's negotiated and being casual about the truth of what he's negotiated. If you look at the text, it's clear there are checks in the Irish Sea. The Prime Minister is pretending that there won't be.
Now, sorry to cut you off, it's because we were doing to move on to something else that was, frankly, not all that easy to understand. This time it was from the Prime Minister, who was speaking at an event in Northern Ireland yesterday, speaking to Northern Ireland Conservatives to try to make sense to them of his Brexit deal. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
And peace and everything else, right? But so when you come out of the EU customs union, which is what we've done, you have to have some way of checking that goods that might attract a tariff going from the United Kingdom into Ireland pay that tariff if there is to be a tariff. The only place you can do it, if you don't do it at the border, is at the border in Northern Ireland. There will not be tariffs or checks on goods coming from GB to I that are not going on to Ireland. That's the whole point. And the great thing that's been misunderstood about this is there will not be checks. There will not be checks. I speak as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and a passionate unionist. There will not be checks on goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. Because we're the government of the United Kingdom and we will not institute or implement or enact such checks. And the idea that Tato crisps from Tandragee Castle are going to be, by some process, it's just nonsense. So actually, Northern Ireland has got a great deal. It's got a great deal. You keep free movement, you keep access to the single market, but you also have, as it says in the deal, unfettered access to GB.
Well, I hope that was all perfectly clear. We'll be taking exam questions at the end of the programme, just to see what the Prime Minister really was trying to say and whether, as many on social media are claiming, that it wasn't quite what's actually in his deal. Let's join the BBC's reality check correspondent, Chris Morris. Chris, there are people, aren't there, saying that he actually hasn't understood his own policy. Could you see any problems with what the Prime Minister was saying there?
Yeah, follow that, as they say, Nick. I mean, there are two things, aren't there? There's goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. Let's deal with that one first. He said there'll be absolutely no checks, which is basically true, but there will be. This was confirmed by the government late last month after some confusion in parliamentary select committees. Those goods will be subject to export declarations. So who checks whether the export declarations have been filled in correctly, and when is a check not a check? This will not be a bloke in a peak cap standing in a booth at the side of the road. But is it really the absolute unfettered access to the GB market which Northern Ireland has been promised? That really matters in Northern Ireland, and there are those who say even if this is a minimal administrative procedure, it still doesn't meet that promise of completely unfettered access. So the government says no checks whatsoever. You speak to most trade experts and they say until we see the detail of how this rather unique system's going to work, of the Northern Ireland staying in the UK customs territory but also following EU customs rules, we can't say for sure that checks have to take place. And so that's the trade going in one way.
I was going to say the other way that he made a big play of, didn't he? It was a great waving of arms about no checks at all when trade goes from Northern Ireland to GB, because of course that's central to the politics of whether the Union, the United Kingdom, is still one. What did you make of that?
So GB to Northern Ireland is even more complicated in a way. So two things he said. He said there'd be no tariffs and no checks unless goods are moving on to the Republic of Ireland. And that's not what his deal says. The deal says that if goods are deemed to be at risk of moving to the Republic of Ireland after going from GB to Northern Ireland, then they could be subject to tariffs. If it then turns out those goods stay in Northern Ireland, companies will be eligible for a rebate on those tariffs, but the tariff would initially have to be paid. As for checks, much more complicated, because Northern Ireland, under the terms of his own deal, will stay in a single regulatory zone with the Republic of Ireland, which will follow EU rules and regulations. And as you know, those are particularly strict on things like food and products of animal origin. Those consignments going from GB to Northern Ireland, every one of them would have to have a documentary check, and there would be a certain number that would have to be physically checked. Now, you can point to a country like New Zealand, where they've done a deal where only 1% of consignments of New Zealand lamb arriving in the EU are ever checked. But to get that deal, New Zealand lamb producers have had to sign up to following nearly all EU rules and regulations.
There's the key to it.
So if you want to diverge in the future, that's a problem.